In the first 10 seconds of this story, you need to understand one chilling fact. A man walked into a police station, sat down under flickering fluorescent lights, and calmly confessed to a brutal crime that he did not commit. A confession so detailed, so convincing, that it would send an innocent person to prison and leave the real truth buried in silence. And this is where today's true crime story begins. On a cold autumn evening in a quiet Midwestern town, the kind of place where everyone thinks they know everyone else, the kind of place where darkness feels heavier because it is unexpected, a young woman named Emily Carter was found dead in her small rented apartment. She was 26 years old, recently engaged, known by friends as gentle and reliable. The type of person who never missed a message and never locked her doors, because she believed in safety through familiarity. And yet on the night of October 14, 2011, someone had entered her home and taken her life. The apartment was modest one-bedroom, thin walls, second floor located above a closed bookstore and across the street from a diner that shut its lights at 9. And when Emily's coworker came to check on her after she missed 2 consecutive shifts at the local hospital, the silence inside was immediate and alarming. Police reports would later describe the scene as orderly but wrong, no signs of forced entry, no clear signs of struggle. Her body discovered on the bedroom floor, a single fatal wound, and almost no physical evidence to point toward a killer, a nightmare scenario for any investigation. The town reacted exactly how you would expect. Fear spread quietly, gossip spread loudly, neighbors whispered about who might be responsible. And within hours, police pressure mounted to find answers to bring calm back to a community that suddenly felt unsafe. Detectives began by interviewing those closest to Emily, her fiancé who had been out of town on a construction job, co-workers, friends, neighbors, and one name kept quietly appearing in the margins of notebooks: Daniel Reeves. Daniel was 31, socially withdrawn, unemployed at the time, and living less than 2 blocks from Emily's apartment. He had occasionally been seen at the same diner had once helped Emily carry groceries during a rainstorm, and in a town desperate for logic, proximity became suspicion. What made Daniel stand out to investigators was not evidence but vulnerability. He had a history of anxiety, a documented struggle with depression, and a personality that police described as eager to please and highly suggestible. And in the world of true crime, those words carry heavy consequences. Daniel was brought in for questioning not because police believed he was the killer, but because they believed he would talk, and talk he did. The interrogation room was small, windowless, painted a dull beige meant to feel neutral but often feeling oppressive, and over the course of 11 hours, without a lawyer present, Daniel slowly unraveled. Detectives raised their voices, lowered them, placed photographs on the table, removed them again, telling Daniel that evidence existed even when it did not, telling him that witnesses had placed him at the scene even though no one had, and repeatedly insisting that they already knew what happened. They just needed him to explain why. As the hours passed, exhaustion replaced resistance. Daniel began to doubt his own memory, asking questions that would later haunt everyone involved. Questions like, what if I was there and I just don't remember? And is it possible to do something like that and block it out? And in that fragile psychological space, the impossible became possible. Around 3 in the morning, Daniel confessed. He described entering Emily's apartment, described an argument, described an act of violence, and when detectives noticed inconsistencies, they corrected him subtly at first, then directly, shaping his words into a cleaner narrative, one that aligned with what they needed, not what was true. This is one of the darkest realities in true crime history. False confessions do not always sound forced. Sometimes they sound cooperative, sometimes they sound remorseful, and sometimes they sound terrifyingly believable. When Daniel signed the confession, his hands were shaking, his voice barely audible, and yet police celebrated quietly, believing the case was solved, paperwork was completed, headlines were written, and within days the town breathed again, convinced that justice was underway. The media portrayal was swift and unforgiving, a troubled man, a quiet obsession, a tragic loss. And in public opinion, Daniel Reeves became a monster long before trial. But behind courtroom doors, cracks in the story began to form. The confession contained details that contradicted forensic evidence, the timeline did not match cell phone records, and there was DNA at the scene that did not belong to Daniel, but these details were minimized, explained away, or delayed because once a Confession exists, it becomes the center of gravity in any criminal case. Daniel's defense attorney, underfunded and overworked, attempted to argue coercion, but the prosecution leaned heavily on the recorded interview, pointing to moments where Daniel spoke freely, where he used his own words, ignoring the hours of psychological manipulation that came before them. The jury, composed of ordinary people with limited understanding of interrogation psychology, believed what they were shown. And after less than 6 hours of deliberation, Daniel Reeves was found guilty of second-degree murder, sentenced to 35 years in prison, a life effectively ended not by violence, but by words he was convinced to say. For years, the case faded into the background of dark case files, another solved crime, another closed chapter, until a graduate student studying wrongful convictions came across Daniel's confession while researching patterns in false admissions. What caught her attention was not what Daniel said, but how detectives responded, steering language, rewarding certain answers, punishing others with silence or frustration, a textbook example of confirmation bias in action. She brought the case to a nonprofit innocence project, and slowly, painfully, the case reopened. New testing on the unidentified DNA revealed a match in a national database, a man with a violent criminal history who had been in the area at the time of the murder, a man with no connection to Daniel and no reason for Daniel to protect him because Daniel did not even know he existed. When confronted with this evidence, the justice system resisted. Appeals were denied, motions delayed, because admitting a mistake carries enormous institutional weight. It took almost a decade, 10 years behind bars, before a judge finally ordered a new hearing where experts in interrogation psychology testified, explaining how false confessions happen, how memory can be manipulated, how fear and exhaustion can override truth. Daniel was released on bond while the case was reviewed, stepping out into a world that had moved on without him. His parents older, his friends gone, his name still stained by a crime he did not commit. Eventually, the conviction was vacated, charges dismissed, and the real killer was arrested, tried, and convicted. But for many, the damage was irreversible. Public reaction was divided. Some were outraged, others confused, some refused to believe the system could be so wrong. Because believing that would mean accepting vulnerability, that any confession, any case, any sense of closure might be built on something fragile. Today, Daniel lives quietly, avoids interviews, and speaks only once a year at conferences about wrongful convictions, repeating one sentence over and over. I confessed because I thought it was the only way to make it stop. This true crime story is not just about a murder. It is about pressure, perception, and the terrifying power of suggestion. It is a reminder that in dark case files around the world, truth does not always emerge from certainty. Sometimes it emerges from doubt, years too late to restore what was taken. As we close this case, one question lingers in the shadows: if a confession can be manufactured, if memory can be rewritten, how many other innocent voices are sitting in cells tonight because they believe the system more than they believe themselves? This is Dark Case Files, where every reminds us that the most dangerous lies are the ones spoken in the name of justice. And now we leave the question with you: do you think false confessions should ever be trusted in true crime investigations, or are they the most deceptive evidence of all? And if this story kept you thinking, subscribe to Dark Case Files for more true crime stories that dig beneath the surface and expose the darkness behind closed cases.